Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're here today with Chris Jones. He is a longtime partner at the storied Silicon Valley product group. Welcome, Chris. We're so happy to have you today.
Thanks so much, Neeta. I'm very honored to be a part of it.
One of the things I find really interesting about SVPG is I think in addition to really being a leading light for many companies, it's a very thought-provoking organization. You and your partners have been talking about lately, a series of conversations around the end of easy money, the effect of Gen I on PMs, whether or not teams are too large, what may or may not be fostering or dragging creativity. There's a lot of really interesting work there. To kick us off, we would start with a question we typically conclude with, and that is, in your view, what do high performance companies do when it comes to product, which is different than what average performers do?
Yeah, thanks. Very excited to be here and talk with you. I very much enjoyed our first conversation, and it seems like we have a lot of ideas here in common. High performance companies, it's interesting. That's always been our framing on this, and specifically in the product universe. SVPG has long talked about itself as we're trying to help companies get aligned with what all of the best companies do. And for us, we've defined that as the ones that are continually able to create new value on behalf of their customers. And as you alluded to, one of the really big things there is that they're just everything they do is aligned around outcomes. These are all really easy words to say, but when you begin to pick it apart and realize what's going on internally, the pulse and the heartbeat of companies, so many of them is about the output. If so much of it is about the output, what people are measured by, what people feel accountable for, what their promotions are based on, what their own self-worth in the company is based on is, did we ship? Did we ship a lot of stuff? Did we make the dates? Did we get through all of the requirements that we needed to get through in order to get there? Wow, I did my job. It's awesome. But the thing is, the company doesn't end up going anywhere as a result of that. And it's because really sometimes nobody, but certainly the people who are creating the products and conceiving of the products aren't really asked to even think about that stuff. A lot of what Silicon Valley Product Group does and has been about is bringing that outcome orientation very far forward, and not just at the highest levels of the company, all the way down to the people who really have their hands on the wheels, the ones who are actually building, even the individual contributor engineers. It's not just, I need to put this thing out in the market. It's, wow, I and the rest of the team here are also responsible for people getting value from this and actually deciding to use it. It's a very different end goal than simply getting to the shipping part. It's not that Silicon Valley Product Group says, yeah, don't bother shipping, just think about outcomes. Obviously, the shipping and the output is a means to an end. The thing that's different is it's not the end in itself. It is truly a means to an end.
I think that's one of the things I really love about how I've heard you all talk about this, because I think that's right.
It's so funny because it seems really obvious when you hear it.
Yeah.
Why don't more companies do that?
But that's the question. Why do you think that is? That's exactly what I wanted to ask.
I think there are a number of reasons why this is the case. I would probably start and say that there's often been a real historical separation between the business and the technology, right? It's this one group that's providing guidance to this other group, and this other group is serving that one group. We have these expectations that are created from these fiefdoms. One side, the other executes. And this actually leads in many cases to a kind of a low trust. Is that execution group really in any sort of position to say anything about what they're working on? It's like, really just shut up and build. You stick to your knitting and we're going to stick to ours. So I think that historical separation between the business and technology is part of it, and it's created some structural reasons. I think there's another reason, and that output in general for many people, especially the most senior managers, it just provides a sense of control and predictability, right? And it runs all the way into how things are financed. So your finance department is going to say, look, yeah, we'll green light this, but you've got to commit to this ROI. And in order to commit to this ROI, you need to tell us what you're going to build and when you're going to deliver it. And it's all set in motion way up there at the beginning. And then the last one, it's a little easier to understand. You start to talk with people about this, and it's not like they don't understand these ideas, but it's a little bit like you're speaking a foreign language because it just never occurred that it could run any other way. So just a lack of role models within these companies.
Do you also feel like when you look at high performers, is it also true that other teams like the dev team, the design team, go to market, all of these are performing at an elevated level? Is that part of the mix, or is it that it really needs to start with product?
The fighting unit within these high performing product organizations are inherently cross-functional from the start. You've got high-performing product managers, you have high-performing designers, you have high-performing engineers, but we're actually trying to have high-performing teams that consist of all of those people. They're relatively small teams, and they're constructed in a certain way. And we're actually moving the political energy away from the functional organization and much more to these cross-functional organizations, back to the accountability and the outcomes. That's where we're landing it. We want it to be on these cross-functional teams. We give them the responsibility for an outcome, and those groups cross-functionally will collaborate in order to achieve that outcome. Obviously, yet another thing that's easy to say that gets pretty tricky in practice, because we now have my managers over here, but my cross-functional team is here, and getting a company transformed around that as an operating model can sometimes be a pretty heavy lift.
One of the things I was curious about is I've also heard you all say that value and viability are really the CEO's job in a startup. So why isn't that the case everywhere?
So we talk a lot about value and viability, and actually we talk about those in the context of a set of 4 risks. So value is really the customer, whatever it is that you're doing or building, it's all about bringing value to that customer. Viability is about, does it work for our business? So whatever solution that we're bringing to these customers, is it actually going to work with our business? Can we go to market with it? Is it compliant with regulations? Is it aligned with our brand? All of those types of things. The other 2 risks that our product teams really need to be concerned with are a little bit more traditional and more understood in a more typical execution model. It has to do with technical feasibility. Can we build it? Can we practically get it done in the amount of time we have? Can we get it to scale? And then there's usability, which speaks more to the overall experience. Can people figure this thing out? Does it make sense? Does it map with their conceptual model of the world? So you've got those 4 things. The thing that typically happens when work is organized around outputs is that your team that's executing really can just take value and viability for granted. Those are the responsibility of whoever it was who asked us to build this thing. If it doesn't work from a value perspective, not my fault. They asked us to do it. They didn't do their diligence.
Right.
Similar with the viability. This is usually coming from the business. If the thing you asked me to build doesn't work for the business, how can I possibly be responsible? In the model that we are really encouraging companies to go to, it's all about the outcome, and the teams themselves are responsible for figuring out how you best get to that outcome. So all of a sudden, value and viability shifts into those teams. And it's the product manager who is the main person who's concerned with those. Of course, the whole team is effectively concerned with all 4 of these risks, but we really do make a point to say that this is why you have product managers. They are going to be first and foremost concerned with, are we delivering value to the customers, and is it viable for the business? You asked about the CEOs and startups and things like that. Most of that, the value and viability, when you've got a startup, the CEO is going to be worried about that. The founders are the ones who are going to do that. As the company starts to scale, and specifically scale in the way we're talking about, where you want these teams feeling that same sort of passion and accountability for the outcomes, you have to figure out how to make sure that they're picking up the value and viability sides of it.
I love this. I have 2 directions in which I would love to travel. One of the things that always struck me as interesting was that many functions seem hyper specialized and really disconnected from another. And I think that you're speaking to this too. There's a reason that PMs in some organizations, maybe in a feature factory, can be a contentious role for colleagues on other teams, right? Because you feel like you're taking orders from this role. I think developers feel that way. I think sometimes the go-to-market teams feel that way. I really see product as more integrated into, whether it's the 4 Ps, if you're looking at it from a marketing or a revenue lens, or just an idea that brings product marketing and pricing closer together, so that what we build, the market we serve, and that business model, to me, the most successful examples feel really integrated. And yet I have seen a lot of companies where again, they're so hyper localized and specialized that it just doesn't seem like they're getting any of that
Yeah,
yield. So I know this is
right.
like a big setup, but what do you think about that?
A lot of the answer, I think, is very much in how you phrase the question. And we spoke about this earlier
Yeah.
and are really aligned on this. And yeah, it was fun to think about the 4 Ps of marketing. Haven't talked about that or thought about that in a while. But in any case, I think the gist of what you're getting at is that many people, whether it's because this thinking around the old 4 Ps of marketing or how processes are set up in companies, they look at product pretty narrowly.
Yes.
What are we building? What are the
That-
engineers actually building, and how do we actually get it built? And how you go to market with it, how you price it, that's somebody else's job. If I'm the product manager on the product, I'm just going to defer to them because they know I'm going to build the best product I can and focus on the things that I need to. And yeah, maybe the 4 Ps sort of suggest that, people aligning into those types of silos. But yeah, interestingly, so much of what Silicon Valley Product Group really promotes is a model of product management and these product teams that is much more holistic in its view and much more integrated. And go to market in particular, which we usually define as how do people find out about whatever it is you've done and obtain whatever it is you've done. But what I just described can be massive in terms of the success of a product. And a product manager in a kind of a larger product team ignores that at their peril. At the very least, what you build needs to be very cognizant of how it's sold and how it's marketed. And really, these things influence each other in such a huge way. The 4 Ps of marketing, products, placement, pricing, and promotion, really, my definition of product management incorporates all 4 of those. It's arguable how much pricing is in there. It's possible you can factor that one out a little bit more, but good product managers are thinking about all of these things. Actually, I've been part of teams where stuff like this has happened, where say you have a consumer product and it's something that helps with productivity and everybody gets this great idea, you know what, we're going to go into small business now. This value that you're providing to a single consumer could just as easily be extended to a collection of a few dozen employees in a company. It's easy. Product work is easy. We just slap a new user interface on it and there you go. You can manage a collection of these things. Everybody focuses on the effort around changing the product, and they don't focus at all on the fact that this is an entirely different customer, an entirely different buying decision, an entirely different way of them finding out that something like this exists, an entirely different reason for buying your product in the first place. A lot of the bits may be exactly the same. A lot of the functionality of the product might be exactly the same. But creating a go-to-market apparatus is just a massive change. And ultimately, that is going to affect how the product itself is constructed. A lot of product managers, especially new product managers, just don't see this as part of their job. They're just blissfully ignorant and they don't really think about these terms at all. I had to learn that myself as well. I came in through engineering. I was originally an engineer before I became a product manager. Luckily, I had a lot of people around me, both my direct managers as well as people in my community who disabused me of the idea that I didn't have to worry about that stuff. And I guess on the good news, that some of that stuff is actually the most interesting aspects of product.
Oh, I totally agree because it's intersectional. It's also where you have more levers, right? And actually, I would connect this back. It's interesting what you're saying. I find pricing to be such an incredible vector in this conversation because it unites what we're building with what the customer actually cares about. And I measure that by their willingness to pay. And it was actually one of the things I heard in that first round interview today, too, which is really interesting that I think a lot of product teams don't necessarily explore early enough. And if your only focus is on growth, the viability question is less important to you, or there's this weird idea that like you'll solve it in the future. And I find that, I just personally find that a little bit tricky to understand. But one of the things I also have noticed because we do this pricing work is that we often come across teams where there's a lot of excitement about the problem that's being solved and a lot of excitement about features, capabilities, like the attributes of the widget. And then also for benefits, meaning what is the anticipated utility of that? Where I think that there's a gap between what is a benefit and what is value. And I bring it full circle because to me, value is what is a customer willing to pay, and not just a Neeta or a Chris, but the segments that we represent, right? That's to me is where scale is. Does any of that kind of tie back into how you think about viability and value?
I think about it pretty similarly.
Okay.
Right? The price of something is a measure of value. What price can this command? If you're going to go from benefits, the aggregate of the benefits that the customer cares about, that's the measure of the value. And then the viability, that's really, will this price and this anticipated level of market size and our ability to penetrate, is that a viable business for us? That's really where those things come together.
How do you think about what makes a great product strategy? How
Right.
do you define it? What do you
Thanks.
want as CEO or founder to think about it?
With product strategy, this is one of the main facets of what we've kind of come around to calling the product operating model. But at the beginning, we were talking about what the best companies do versus what the rest of the companies do, and putting a name on this thing as the product operating model. Not a process, not really a framework. It's more a set of principles. But one of the big aspects is just deciding what problems you're going to work on, what problems to actually solve. And that is the realm of product strategy. Most companies who aren't following the product operating model have a collection of business stakeholders, each with their own independent agendas, and they're all banging on the product organization to get their agendas met. And in these other companies, what they're typically doing is trying to make sense of all of this stuff, prioritize across a little bit here, a little bit there, making as many of the stakeholders happy as you possibly can. And in the case of the product model, there is a real overt conscious effort to say yes to these things, no to these things, maybe later to these things. It's having a real point of view on where the product needs to go in order to advance toward more of an end game vision that you're looking for on the product and meet as many of the overall kind of business objectives that you need to. But it's not just this peanut butter approach of a little here. Inevitably, some people are going to be unhappy. One of the other aspects of this, favorite quote of mine on this, is from Steve Jobs, where he says, focus. A lot of people think that focus means that you got to work on the things that you're focusing on, saying yes to the things that you're focusing on. So that's not what it means at all. What focus means is saying no to hundreds of other good ideas. And that's the operative word. There are a lot of good ideas that are going to be really painful to not work on. So that's one big facet of it. There's another big facet that we talk about that we see really with the best companies, and that's that the leaders are involved, right? They haven't just delegated. Some people hear about all this empowerment stuff, and it's like, okay, my job is to entirely step away and let them do their thing. And that's wrong. What the good leaders do is, they create that empowerment, but they are deeply engaged in what's going on. They know what's going on with the product data. They know what the teams are learning as they're talking to customers. They understand how things are working in the go-to-market. They're following the industry. They know what the competitors are. They know what's going on in technology. And they bring all of this to bear. You never know when you're going to come across that one insight that's going to make the difference in terms of how you approach what you're going to be focusing on and how you actually focus on it. It's still messy, right? With all of this stuff, there is never a paint by numbers approach, but those are two really important attributes of kind of what product strategy looks like. There's actually a couple of others that it's worth talking about. One is that it's got to be transparent to the company. Just because it's not enough just to say, okay, we're focusing on these things, we're not focusing on these things. There has to be a rationale as to why, and it has to be communicated out. Not for consensus. You're not going to get consensus. You're probably going to have a lot of people who will disagree with that particular approach, but they should at least understand why the company is making the decisions, why the product leaders are making the decisions they are, why this is motivated, at least in their minds. And another aspect that we see in really good strategic thinking is just this notion of placing bets. Right. So it's not like we're going to do this lockup thing. This happens and this happens and every step has to happen. It's usually probabilities and spreading things out in ways that you can have a lot of success. That doesn't mean that it's against a good strategy. You can have a lot of things failing. That doesn't mean that you've had a bad strategy. Those things are a bit independent.
This is the thesis of halo effect, right? That you can't let the end results define whether or not it was actually a good strategy, even though that's our human inclination.
And if you're placing bets, there's going to be a mix. There's going to be some things working, things not working. Hopefully in aggregate, everything will advance. Yeah,
absolutely. If you're the leader of a company that wants to really go through this process of kind of refocusing as much as a large company, but even within a smaller company? What does that look like?
Yeah. So the word we use for this is transformation. And the framing is basically it's around the operating model. And these are companies that are looking to get more aligned with the product operating model, the one that I've been describing here.
Right.
And usually it starts with some sort of assessment. It's like, okay, we aren't there and we're failing in various ways. We're not achieving outcomes with technology. We're not able to innovate. So they're looking to the operating model as a way to get there. And transformation, the way I usually describe it is that you assess your company, you're here, you've got this vision of what the full product operating model is going to be. All the space in between is transformation. How do you get from here to here? And there's a few things that can really derail people pretty early on. The first one is you hear a lot about digital transformation. We're going through a transformation. They assume that people who are framing that are often assuming that this is really just engineering. It's how we build our products, right? We've got to get our architecture into a microservices sort of thing. We've got to get our development working so that we've got automated testing and QA so that we can get a CI/CD pipeline and all the DevOps, and we're going to roll out Scrum or some other agile format and really get our velocity up in terms of engineering and all of that. That's all part of it for sure, but it's probably the smallest part. There are some other parts that start to get much further away from engineering. What I've just described is how you build, but there's also how you solve problems. And that's where we started, executing against a roadmap of features, or are you achieving outcomes? Are you solving problem? That's a very different mindset.
Right.
It leads to different people. It leads to a different way of assigning accountability. It leads to different incentives throughout the entire company. And then there's this third thing. How do you decide which problems to solve? And that really is starting to get at how do the most senior people in the product organization relate to the most senior people in all the businesses? Because we're no longer doing a prioritization and intake effort. We're actually coming up with a coherent strategy that rationalizes all of this stuff. A real transformation of the product model ultimately involves the whole company. And if your CEO isn't involved in this, or they need to be seen as a champion of this. They don't necessarily need to be the expert in it or come up with the plan, but they need to be seen as the champion of this. And if they're not, there's only so far you're going to be able to go.
Do you see differences then in more of a tech-centric or a tech company versus non-tech in how you're implementing this model?
Less and less. And actually, the term that we use is really tech-enabled. And when you start to look at it that way, nearly every company out there is tech-enabled in some way. A simple way to think about this is to look at a company like Airbnb or a company like Uber, right? I think people would generally call these tech companies, but most of the experience is a very physical world, physical asset experience. And the industries that they came up against were traditional, old, ancient industries, right? So that's where tech enablement has allowed them to really re-envision what a customer experience would be, re-envision what a business model would be. When you start to realize that, like every company, tech either provides an opportunity or a threat to them, depending on how they look at it. So yeah, I think early on, I've been in the Silicon Valley Product Group for about 10 years, and early on, it was more what you would consider a traditional software company or something like that was trying to get aligned with these ideas. The vast majority of my companies, though, now are from old industries that are just modernizing, and they're looking at technology in less as an adornment to what they were doing before, or people need to service their account through an app or things like that. And they're looking at it much more holistically, where when you bring tech in, your entire opportunity around the value that you can bring to your customer is so different and so much bigger.
Are there any life cycle limitations in this? You've talked about both legacy companies and maybe more, I guess, younger companies, but even Google is 30 years old at this point. Anything else that you think about?
Life cycles of the companies or life cycle? I guess one thing I can say in terms of life cycle, the cycle of a company is that if you're forming the company now, or if you formed it in the last 5 or 10 years, it's a lot easier to get started on this path, right? It's a lot easier as you're establishing things right from the beginning to have more and more of these attributes of the product model in the get-go. The further on you've gotten, the more established and ossified these things are. You've got more people with kingdoms that are functional or around particular businesses. It gets more difficult to figure out how you're going to layer this stuff on. So I guess in that sense, yeah, older industries, they've got a bigger hole to climb out of. But I think if you've got the right people, especially the leaders, you can really affect a pretty healthy transformation, even in a big complex company, in a time shorter than you would assume. It can be done in a couple of years even.
That makes sense. One other topic I wanted to talk about, when I look at some of your work and SVPG's work, it really seems to me that you're encouraging product teams to think bigger, take bigger swings, place bigger and appropriate bets. We've just come out of this era where the growth team really seemed to dominate more than the big swings of product. Are we still in this era of maybe an excessive focus on optimization? Though that's my characterization. You may or may not agree with it. Because that's something like it's a little bit of a theme that I hear from other product leaders as well.
Yeah, and maybe I'll take this in two parts. We
Sure.
can talk about risks and taking big swings and where that fits into this whole model. And then we can talk about growth teams and where I've seen them go. This really, in many ways, gets to that, how do we solve problems? There are some problems that are really big. There are some problems that they've been there a while, but we're going to take a really big swing at a new way of solving that problem. There are many techniques out there for doing this, basically trying things out in a much more experimental way without committing a ton of resources to actually building it. The old school way to do it is, if you want to take a risk, you got to build it and you got to put it out there and then take the swing. And many companies really don't realize that there's a lot you can figure out, a lot of kind of risk you can wring out of this very cheaply just by being clever on how you run experiments, how you build prototypes, how you interact with users, how you leverage those types of insights. And then leaders are going to help set the parameters of that. In some cases, a particular team, you needed to take a big swing. And with this other team, for what they're working on, we actually need some kind of slow and steady here. We're looking for more incremental improvements. And there are different tools for those different jobs for taking this risk, but still doing it in a responsible way and protecting your business and protecting your brand and protecting your coworkers. And as far as growth teams, yeah, I don't hear it as much anymore. I know it was a really big deal maybe 5 to 10 years ago or so. And I certainly experimented with these at a couple of the companies that I worked at. I can just tell you my own experience with them. And the way I define it is usually you've got a topology of teams. They've got their various areas of responsibility, however you want to divide it up. It might be by particular personas or particular areas of a product experience or particular vertical markets or particular go-to-markets that they're aligned with. There's just any number of ways to divide this up. But you could also put a growth team in there, and its job is, however makes sense, we're going to look at this particular part in our customer funnel, and we're going to turn that up. A lot of times it's at the top of the funnel. In some cases, it might be converting from free to premium. Sometimes you might have a single growth team, and it's going to get those different objectives at different times. They tend to be really fast and very experimental. They use what are traditionally thought of as marketing techniques together with product techniques. So oftentimes there'll be a product marketer in there, or sometimes they actually call them a growth marketer, and they do a lot of stuff. They often get caught up in a lot of optimizations. They make progress, but it's a few basis points here, a few basis points there. We're moving that stuff up. And that may be what you need. And they may, during that course of that, stumble upon the big insight that maybe is a little bit bigger. It's pretty rare. But that may be what you need. Usually with startups, they don't need that. They don't need the 10 basis points. They need 10,000 basis points. And there are probably better ways to do it than just running a ton of experiments in a particular week. But the other problem I had that you didn't mention is I just found these teams so disruptive to the other teams because they typically didn't have a single part of the product experience that they actually owned. They could free rein to operate anywhere. And as a result, they would get in the way of a lot of other teams and just leave this mayhem behind them. I was doing it wrong, but I got soured enough on it that what I prefer to do is take my existing teams and put growth objectives on a set of existing teams for a particular period of time. For this quarter, this team, we want you working on growth in this area, as opposed to these generalized growth teams that kind of anything goes.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. The other area of conflict I've seen is just between the regular product dev teams, et cetera, marketing team, and the growth team, right? Sometimes it seems like the growth folks are off doing like fun, exciting things that are like just high numbers and hitting the gong or whatever. But
The
the rest of the
team.
company is like, what are we doing here? It seems to me that the question is, are we solving the right problem? And then have we tuned it from a resource perspective too, which I think is where you are too.
Yeah,
Amazing.
yeah.
This has been such a great conversation as I knew it would be. And before our last question, is there anything else that you wanted to share?
Let's see. I guess I would just say that it's a really fun way to work when if you can get your company working this way. But it's not easy. It's definitely not something to be taken lightly. And yeah, just reiterating that the product operating model just is something that covers the entire company. And looking at it that way from the start is going to set you up to approach it in a way that's going to, lead you to a lot more likelihood of success.
So that's a great segue then to the last question, which is, what's your top advice for CEOs or senior executives that might be interested in this?
You have to be an advocate for this. You have to be seen as an advocate for this. You can't just delegate this. Somebody else is going to be probably driving it other than the CEO. But if you're not seen as a partner, people aren't going to take it seriously. Again, it spans far beyond the product and engineering and design groups. It gets into how all the other parts of the business work with these groups. And those other parts, whether it's sales or marketing or compliance or legal, whatever that is, they don't report to the product organization. And so if there is a difference in how these have to work with one another, the CEO is going to have to provide that sort of guidance.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. I knew it would be a great conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Really fun. Thanks, Neeta.
Thanks for joining us here at Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review, follow the show, or share it with a friend. We're a news show, so it really helps other listeners find us. If you have feedback, comments, or suggestions for episodes or guests, please reach out to us. You can find our information in the show notes.